Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final spring webinar in the Redbird Educator Series. I'm Deborah McPhee, Director of the Borg Center for Reading and Literacy, and Molly Davis, Director of Constituent Relations in the College of Education, is working behind the scenes today. We're excited you're here. We are lucky to have Dr. Aaron Quast with us today to share her knowledge in a presentation titled Towards Engaging and Relevant Disciplinary Literacy. As always, we encourage you to use the chat feature and post comments and questions, and to engage each other around the ideas and strategies shared during the presentation. I will monitor the chat and rejoin the webinar later to moderate a Q&A with Dr. Quast. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Aaron Quast to the Redbird Educator Series. Dr. Quast is an assistant professor of elementary literacy at Illinois State University. Her experiences as a former early childhood teacher in Washington, D.C. shaped her scholarly focus on equitable literacy instruction that honors students' social and cultural backgrounds. Her research in this area is published in prominent practitioner-oriented journals like The Reading Teacher and Language Arts. Dr. Quast teaches undergraduate and graduate literacy courses, supporting pre- and in-service teachers in cultivating meaning and inclusive literacy learning environments. Welcome, Dr. Quast.
There we go. I've got it. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. McPhee, for that warm and welcoming introduction. Thank you to the Borg Center and for ISU College of Education for allowing me into this space. I want to also give a shout out to this wonderful series that you all have put together over the course of this academic year. If y'all haven't seen my colleagues' other sessions, please go check them out. I know they're on YouTube. I was watching some of them as I started to get ready for this session, and there's just such wonderful ideas in there. I want to take a moment to thank you all for joining me today on this beautiful-ish, we'll call it spring April day. At least the snow is behind us, let's hope. I'm hoping today to make this afternoon session meaningfully for you, and that I'm going to invite you into a discussion. Let me get my slides working. One second, y'all. There we go. I'm going to invite you into the discussion today that centers around something that has really come to the foreground of literacy research, let's say in the past decade or so, and that is disciplinary literacy. What I mean by that is how we engage students in reading, writing, and language or speaking practices in subject areas such as social sciences, arts, mathematics, etc. So as the title of my session indicates, then I'm going to encourage us to move towards. So when we say towards, that means that we're currently kind of at a place and we need to head into a direction. And that direction is has been gaining traction in the field over the last couple of years. Now, like any new thing though in education, and we're all familiar with this, it comes with its problems and its tensions. And because of that, I'm going to encourage us all today, not just to adopt disciplinary literacy, but to adopt engaging and relevant disciplinary literacy. So this afternoon, I'm going to approach the topic in that order, though. We'll first take a look at what disciplinary literacy is. We'll talk about the why it's important to do culturally relevant disciplinary literacy and how that might look. And then finally, I'm going to touch on this word engaging, and I'm going to push us to consider engaging to whom. All right, so as promised in this title description that Dr. McPhee and the Borg Center made me write all the way back in January, but I will stick to it, is that I am going to aim to make sure that I cover kind of different subject areas and grade levels. But I will be the first one to tell you I am not an expert in your subject area. You are. You bring those expertise. And in fact, disciplinary literacy is going to ask you to center your expertise in your knowledge. What I'm going to bring to the table here is about 10 years or so of researching and thinking and working with scholars, teacher candidates, and in-service teachers. Some of you are here today because you've been in my class before, so welcome. It's good to see you again. But my work with them to help us to kind of shed light on what this is and how we might use it to transform existing practices. Fair enough? Okay, great. I also encourage you to use the chat. Just because of the nature of the session, I'm going to be talking a little bit more at you than with you. I don't like that, but we're going to put as much as we can into this hour together. So please pop comments in the chats, or if you're disagreeing or seeing things differently, I encourage that as well. Let's begin then. So let's start with this idea of disciplinary literacy. So like me, you might have heard this word at some point, maybe around when the Common Core was released, if we've been teaching for that long. And if you were like me, you might have said, what is this thing? You might have been confused as to what disciplinary literacy might mean. In fact, some of you, just like I did about 10 years ago, was pretty sure I was already doing disciplinary literacy, because disciplinary literacy is essentially just a fancier term in a new shiny package, which we often do in education, for content literacy. So I, as well as a lot of other people, make this assumption that the two are essentially interchangeable with some nuances. Okay. And in fact, when I read through literature now, and when I look at some of the books that we have circulating out there, it very much is true that these two terminologies are often conflated. So I want to work to tease apart, because I do think the difference between these two makes a key difference. So let's start with a definitional understanding, right? We do this all the time with our students. Let's take a moment and read these definitions. And I am going to ask you to read them to yourself. I'm not going to read them out loud, but just take a moment. These are from ILA, which is a very prominent literacy association. Go ahead and start with disciplinary literacy and then read content literacy. All right. So hopefully you've got the sense of, wow, the two are different, right? You've read the definitions. We do this with our students sometimes. We introduce terminology, we define them, and we're ready to go. No, not so much. I can tell you that I can read these. I can read this at a word level. I can even start to make sense of it at a sentence level. But conceptually, I think these definitions are still kind of confusing. In fact, the fact that they also refer to C also content area literacy and C also disciplinary literacy kind of sets it up that the two are very similar, but they're not. So let's go back a little bit. Let me give you a little bit of a historical context to try to make sense of these two different approaches. So let's talk content literacy first. Some of you might have been teaching, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, around the turn, 20 years ago, around the turn of the century. And when this slogan, this idea, or something similar, every teacher is a teacher of reading, really became prominent, right? There was big drives, district-wide drives, school-wide drives to have teachers of all subject areas, and in all subject areas, if you're an elementary teacher or an ECE teacher, really focus on reading in the content areas. Okay, now the reason for that is that, there's a couple of reasons for this, but I'm going to focus on one. And this was the idea that we often refer to as the fourth grade slump. You've probably heard this, where reading scores shift for fourth graders when fourth graders begin to not learn how to read, but read to learn, right? There's this common myth about this. And when we took a closer look at that in research and scholarship, we often attended to the different types of materials that kids are learning in the content areas, meaning textbooks, articles, that sort of stuff. And there's certainly some truth to this, right? Like textbooks and informational articles and content area text, they're difficult, y'all, right? If you do an analysis, and I make my students do this every year, we analyze it, we look at specialized vocabulary, we look at syntactical structure, organizational features, the use of, passive versus active voice. All of that can be very hard for readers that are trying to learn content on top of that. And so the approach back then was, well, we just have to make sure we're focusing on reading comprehension. And all these toolboxes of strategies came out. Are you familiar with this, right? So we would do close readings, or we'd do inferences, or we'd focus on different strategies a week in different subject areas. And what happened, though, is that we didn't see a lot of traction. And here I'm going to put up a study that might, if you were one of those people, right, if you were in a subject area and you were struggling with this idea that, like, I am not a teacher of reading, right? Like, I am not a writing teacher. I am a science teacher, or I am a mathematics teacher. There was a lot of tension with content area teachers around this idea. There was a lot of resistance. There was also a big complaint that we were focusing way too much on reading and writing skill sets and the mechanics of that versus the actual discipline or the content subject. And all of that had truths. And then this is a beautiful article that I'm putting up here that's by Server and Draper that talk about this. And here's what I'm going to tell you today. You're right. If this was you, you were right to an extent. Okay. You're not a reading and writing teacher. Okay, your goal is not to do reading comprehension. That's not potentially your expertise. But what I will say is that you are a literacy teacher. And you are a literacy teacher because you are familiar with the literacies of your discipline. Okay, you might not be familiar with generalized reading strategies as much, but how people read, write, and speak and communicate knowledge in your discipline, you have expertise on. So let's go back to the definitions, because I'm going to do something I often do with my students, and that's revise this definition, make it better. So I'm going to, all those fancy words in the front, I'm going to take that out in disciplinary literacy, and I'm going to say, the literacy practice that supports, and here's the key that I'm thinking, the ways of interpreting, evaluating, and conveying evidence and information within a particular discipline. Okay, so when we think about disciplinary literacy, then it is not content literacy. It's not generic strategies that we're going to use across content text to make sense of what is being said. Okay, it's essentially looking at inquiry processes and the way that people in the sciences or the social science or the mathematics evaluate, construct, and then disseminate knowledge. Okay, and the literacies that support that process. It's a process. Now, at this point, you might not be convinced, right? Because what I'm doing right now is actually a very traditional content literacy approach. I'm trying to give you and build up all this background knowledge so that you understand it and then apply it. But let's flip it up. Let's flip it up. Let's do a disciplinary literacy approach. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take us on a tangent. Follow me here, okay? We'll loop back to disciplinary literacy, I promise. Okay, I'm going to take this on a tangent, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the word gap here. Now, the word gap is not disciplinary literacy. Disconnect from disciplinary literacy for a second. Has anybody heard about the term the word gap before? I'm wondering if anybody's going to throw that in the chat, and if you don't, that's okay. Maybe some of my ECE or elementary folks, they know what this is, okay? And if you don't specifically know, if you can't describe to me what the word gap is, I know that you felt its effects, okay? So the word gap is essentially the study, I believe it was done in the 1970s, the first study, by some researchers who went into families. So they went into families and they had two populations they were looking at, what they referred to as affluent families or high income families, and then low income families. And they tracked the number of words spoken or heard by different, by kids in those families. And basically they drew this conclusion that children that come from affluent families hear significantly more words than children who, yes, okay, somebody has heard of this, sorry, than significantly more words than students from non-affluent families or working class backgrounds. Okay, the researchers then went on to later conclude that this explained differences in academic achievement between children. Thank you, Anna. Sorry, I get distracted by the comments. I'm going to have Dr. McPhee keep track of those. I'm going to keep going. So, so this was the research. So this, I'm just filling you in because here's what I did. When I first was told about disciplinary literacy and then told I was going to teach it and teach it in a teacher education program, I was like, I'm not sure if I'm behind this. I don't quite understand it. So I went ahead and I gathered some experts. Now I'm calling all these people experts. They are, I all know them personally, but I'm going to call them experts because they would never identify themselves as experts. But here's what I did. I wanted to look at this way of interpreting, evaluating, and conveying evidence and how different disciplines, so noting the disciplines and difference and how it does, and how they do it. So I gave them a copy of a research summary written by the original researchers of the word gap to read. Okay, this was a summary. They were looking at some of the longitudinal data that they had gathered, and they published a summary called the Early Catastrophe, the 30 million word gap by age 3. Oh, I can't really articulate that today. So what I'm going to do in just a second is I interviewed them. I said, read this, and then I want you to go ahead and talk to me about it. I'm going to play a snippet of this. And if you were in a class with me before, you've seen part of it, but it's always interesting to look at. So I'm going to play a snippet. And what I want us to do is I want us to analyze what's happening here. Okay, think about these people and how they're making sense of it. All I said is give me your general reactions, how they're making sense of it based upon who they are and their disciplinary fields. 1 second while I cue the video, y'all. Thanks for being patient. You would think with all this practice on Zoom, I'd have it down by now. All right, here we go. Yep.
think so speaking historically, it seems to fall just in line with the general criticisms of what the ESEA or the education secondary, I forgot. The ESEA, the one that President Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Oh, secondary and yeah, what was that called? I know
Education
what
Act.
Yes, the Education Act. Yeah.
That along with this war on poverty, included the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. That Head Start and these other programs did not produce what they intended it to create. That the successes that the article points to initially, and then it fizzling out as time progressed, was kind of the same results of early child programs under Johnson. That they didn't end up creating the kind of dynamic society that he had hoped. But we have this narrative that's continues to persist to this day, that the program is very successful. It's brought people out of poverty, and it connects to a larger narrative on this idea of rugged individualism, and that, you know, once people get a little help, they can push on beyond themselves. And yeah, it in many ways confirmed that what people are starting to understand now about these programs is that it didn't work. And this was a good article to show, to trace, to find the problems. It kind of quantified through evidence and research where things specifically fell apart, and I appreciated that.
I think that like new things that I had like thought about was, again, I really liked that they differentiated between like the number of words said versus the quality of the word versus the content of the word. But I thought that maybe there were like all of these other factors that like weren't taken into account. For example, they like only studied the parents interacting with the children, and then we didn't hear like anything about the different school systems that the children were in, like so the effect of teachers or the effect of I don't know, like how students like get to school. I mean, I learned a lot of the words that I know on like that like transportation trip, and so I guess like not necessarily that because I don't know a lot as an architect or a mathematician or whatever, I don't know like a lot about like the methodology of psychologists or sociologists or education researchers, but maybe not to keep all of those things consistent, but I would have liked to know a little more background on each of the students, and like how those things were kept consistent, or were they thought of, or what. So first of all, I actually, like, real quick, I do want to talk about the title of the article. So it's the early catastrophe, the 30 million word gap by age 3. I didn't, that like as like a way of like marketing was like pretty striking, because like I don't know how many words are in the English language, but I don't think it's that many.
Yeah, it's not actual words. Like that's,
it's like hits or something.
Yeah, it's misleading.
Yeah. But it like does, but then like it does like lead you to think about like all the different ways that you like can parameterize the wage gap. So
my general reactions, I will share the things that stood out most to me. And that would be among them the very limited number of students that they had in the different populations, especially the unequal proportion of African American students in the different populations, as well as a little bit of ambiguity in how the different things were scored. Who exactly was doing the scoring? How was the blinding doing? Especially given the unequal proportions and different number of students in the different populations that they divided up.
Okay, so you had some concerns definitely with, it sounds like, their methodology, their descriptions of sampling sizes, and potentially measuring systems.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it was purported to be some sort of qualitative study. I found it coming from hard science, where it was a little bit ambiguous as to how they did these things. They seem to have some small claims that they then blew up into giant claims of 3 million words, especially taking from birth to 3 years old. I found their claims to be very explosive, or what's the word I'm exactly looking for is exponential growth as far as how they did their calculations. I found their conclusions in general to be extremely broad and not very specific to whatever they had tested. Claims like, what was it? Experience is sequential. Yeah. I was like, I don't know whose experience is not sequential. Maybe they're going through time warps. But they then said broad things like this to kind of support their claims, which I found suspect. I was like, well, they're not making claims that you're not using justifications that really address their claims that they made. So it made me question everything that they had started to.
Okay.
My general reaction to the article, it wasn't surprising to me that someone would do a study and come away with those findings. I am a very big believer in that a lot of your success is going to be attributed to your environment and how you come up. And success is also something that that we can look at in different ways. One person's success is different from another person's success. And I think it's the same thing when you talk about vocabulary. What one person thinks is an extensive vocabulary, a huge vocabulary, or what one person thinks are words that actually mean something would be different in a different environment. And I think that's what you saw play out in this actual study.
Okay.
So to give you, I don't know if everybody understands what an assistant attorney does.
Yeah.
So to start, what I do, I tell people all the time, if you've watched Law and Order, then that helps. I'm the second part of Law and Order. But what I do is I am a prosecutor. I prosecute felony crimes. So if someone commits a felony crime, there's an investigation. The police do an investigation. They turn over the file to us. The file is presented to the grand jury, and then we kind of decide whether we're going to, the grand jury decides whether or not we're going to go forward with the case. We kind of decide what we want to recommend as far as sentencing recommendations and things like that. So anyway, people end up in front of me and the judge all the time, either pleading guilty to cases, which most often happens, or going to trial. Now, the reason why I think what sticks out to me with how this study matters as far as my profession is, I see people go before judges all the time, and it's the most important time in their life because their freedom could be taken away, and their freedom is often taken away. And it's a time when it's important for you to be able to speak to the judge, for you to be able to communicate with the judge. And if you don't communicate in the same way as the judge, there's going to be it's not going to be obviously be beneficial for you. And I see that all the time. I see certain people come before the judge.
All right, I'm going to stop it there. Thank you all for paying attention to that. I did play a little 10-minute segment of that because I think it's really important. For me, it really helped to illuminate the differences in the disciplines, essentially how they're taking their disciplinary norms and reading this article to make sense of it, to weigh it against, what counts as evidence, what counts as claims, what could be applicable, what might not. So let me get back to the slideshow. There we go. So thanks. All right. So when you think about this, now I often do this exercise with my students of all grade levels too. I've done this in preschool. You take you take images of people and you put speech bubbles, and then you have imagined what people might be saying. And so when we think about the word gap, and we think about then how each of these disciplines are doing these practices, you have my sister, and yes, that was my sister, and she's a neuroscientist at Harvard, and she was a hater, y'all. She very much was like, no, I wouldn't even. She even told me later on this study would never be published in a journal because it does not meet the standards, the rigor of methodology that she would read. And she found the claims to be very ungrounded and unfounded. She actually got very angry about it as well. Then you have Altair Peterson, who is an architect, and she very much talks about how are things quantified? How are they quantifying reality? What are the parameters? What is being counted and what is not being counted? And then
Christopher Carter, he very much said like, oh yeah, this makes sense to me because the way we perceive people talking has great consequences on their outcomes in life. And actually that connects to teaching too. The way we think different people talk and the vocabulary they bring is how we ultimately judge them a lot of times. And finally, Dr. Tyra, who is a historical education professor in Hawaii, was talking about like, yeah, this very much maps onto the ideology of the time, this war on poverty that really wasn't true. And what there isn't this culture, I mean, not the war of poverty, I'm sorry, the culture of poverty, and kind of disrupting that methodology and saying that this is very much grounded into it. Now I say this all, okay, at this point, I usually get people saying like, okay, what does this mean for my students, my 11th grader or my 6th grader or my 5th grader, right? They're not at Harvard, they're not at University of Hawaii, they don't have their JDs yet. But I think this shows you the types of thinking practices that we should center. Rather than just reading to learn and all learning the same strategies to read across, we need to invoke in students the different ways to think and make sense about what they read, what they write, and what they explore in the world. So in this sense, we're going to push these processes to the foreground. Okay. Now, we can unpack this a little further, right? Because I'm talking about literacy. I'm not just talking about disciplinary knowledge. Y'all have the expertise in this. I'm talking about literacies. And what we find is, and I have my students do this too, once they go through these interviews that are a little longer, I'll be honest with you, they start to identify the different types of reading, writing, and speaking practices that are done in each one of these experts fields, we'll call it. Okay, and so things, for example, the historian starts talking about is document analysis, sourcing, primary sources, interviewing is a big literacy practice, storytelling. So in his field of history, when he goes to communicate through research articles and whatnot, there's more storytelling. It's not just all factual, weaving in interview segments. I would love to see kids interviewing more. There is a world of knowledge. They could capture so much rich history about their school and their lives and their community lives. Christopher Carter, who at this time was an assistant district attorney, he starts talking about all the things he does literacy related. Like, I'm not just reviewing case files, I'm putting them together to construct a narrative. He talks very much about word analysis and how in the field of law, he very much is debating words such as like may and should, and how different interpretations are going to mean a different end result. So it's all about debating on a word level, but not coming to a specific conclusion, trying to help each other and convince each other of what it could mean. Okay, so what then, and I'll kind of stop there and kind of wrap up this idea of what disciplinary literacy is, because I'll show you with classroom examples here. I promise they're coming. But basically what we're doing with disciplinary literacy and why it's different than content literacy is that we're privileging inquiry processes in the disciplines. We're acknowledging them. We're saying that disciplines are basically subcultures, okay? And that each of those subcultures have shared understandings, and therefore the goal is to apprentice our students into those shared practices, the practices that helps knowledge construction. Okay, the literacy then supports that. Right? The literacy is not the learning, it's the supporting of that inquiry process. And so what we're doing in disciplinary literacy is we're helping students to learn how reading, writing, and speaking will look different in those different domains. I'm just going to plug this here. If you are somebody who wants proof, here's a little bit of proof that's coming out. Research is coming out where they're looking at more quantitative studies of this disciplinary literacy approach versus business as usual. This was done in a kindergarten class in which they, assign different classrooms to go ahead and do either a disciplinary literacy approach or continue the science curriculum, which was very much much reading and then learning science content. And then they found that there were more gains in the classrooms that did this disciplinary literacy approach. Right. But here's the troubling thing. I'm all for disciplinary literacy, but when I look at these experts and I look at the fields that they represent, I know there are some problems with those disciplines, and there are particularly problems with whose knowledge counts and whose knowledge has historically been represented. And this is a problem that we see in classrooms too. Right? Oftentimes classrooms are framed in a narrow interpretation of what students are represented and what students' knowledges are represented. So what I'm talking about is the need for culturally relevant disciplinary literacy. Now, when I say culturally relevant, I'm invoking Gloria Ladson-Billings, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. I'm not going to give a summary of kind of her line of thinking on this. If you are not familiar with her, I recommend you Google her. She has a career worth of wonderful resources and ideas on how we move to culturally relevant pedagogies. I'm going to draw on her work, though, and I'm going to talk about disciplinary literacy and according to these three aspects. Excuse me. The first one is that we have to diversify the disciplines. Okay. What does that mean? Well, if you look at our experts here, hello, experts. Each one of these experts are considered to be historically, aspects of their identity are historically marginalized in their disciplines, right? They had to fight very hard to get to where they are. Either it's because, in some disciplines, we don't see as many women. In many of the disciplines, we don't see many people of color. Okay. And so the value in having diversifying our disciplines, not only in the experts, as also in our curriculum, is that we need people to see themselves. We need people to see who they are, that they can be a scientist, that they can be a mathematician. Okay, so that's one reason why we need it. Now, I'm going to give you an example. I often do this exercise in my classes, and I ask my students to think of a scientist. And then I ask my students to draw a scientist. Okay, here's what their drawings, like 90% of them look like. The stereotypical image of an older white gentleman with crazy hair, right? We're invoking Einstein here, in a white lab coat. Okay. If I'm lucky, about 10% of them will draw a woman. I have yet to anybody actually draw somebody who I asked them, did you imagine a scientist of color? A Black, Indigenous, Latina, Latino scientist? No, I usually get no. I've never had somebody draw a scientist outside of the laboratory, in the ocean, for example. And I hope someday I have somebody draw a scientist that is in their community, a farmer. And I really hope someday I have somebody draw a scientist that's a child, because children are scientists too. But I don't, because it's ingrained in us, right, through media, through the schooling, through who's introduced as a scientist, that scientists look a particular way. And that's this way. But they aren't, right? So not only do we have to have representation, we have to value the representation for what it brings. So different walks of life and different identities will lend itself to different perspectives. And as a society, we need those perspectives so we can develop a more complex understanding of the world. I'll give you an example. Dr. Tyra here, I said he was an historical educational researcher. Okay, so Dr. Tyra's research is fascinating because what he does is he pushes back on this myth that Hawaii, and particularly Native Hawaiians, were passively accepted Americanization or colonizations of the islands, particularly within this time frame from 1900 to about 1960. Okay, there is a myth. And when we think about historical accounts and how we frame Hawaii, we often think about this welcome, accepting, wanting to be Americanized. Okay, but Dr. Tyra's research is like, no, that's not true. Here's so much evidence that shows how Native Hawaiians were, they were advocating, they were empowering themselves, they were resisting in all these ways. And the reason he was able to disrupt this narrative is because he's multilingual. One of the reasons we'll say is because he's multilingual. He can read and write in Hawaiian as well as English and Japanese. So he was able to look at primary sources that were written in Hawaii. A lot of the history is written by primary sources written in English, right? So he's like, no, here's really what's happening. Let me complicate this idea for you so that we can know better and do better going forward. And so there, again, we need to think about how we can diversify so that we can bring in other ideas, which brings me to the second notion of centering different ways of knowing. Once we have representation, once we have other people at the board, once we have kids aspiring to be different things, we then have to really listen to what they're bringing with. We have to listen to, some people might call or recognize their funds of knowledge. I'm going to turn to Dr. Megan Bang, who I think is at Northwestern now, and some of the colleagues that she's working with to help us to make this concrete, okay, to make it really concrete in a classroom example. So Dr. Bang, she has this idea that one of the issues that we currently have, particularly with science education, but I would apply it to all fields, is that we teach content like it's settled, like it's known facts. like it's known theory, like it's concepts we just need kids to reproduce or regurgitate in some sort of fashion. When the truth is, when you look into these disciplines, nothing is ever really settled, right? Or if we think it's pretty much settled, then we use it in compelling ways to think about other things. Okay. And what she vows for is us to make a move to desettling expectations in science education, and I'm going to argue education in general. So I'm going to give you a classroom example. Now, this comes from this paper that I'm showing down in the left-hand corner. Okay, when I read this example in a classroom, I was like, whoa, this is me. I felt like the teacher was me, and it might feel like you too. So she's going to help us reframe what's happening here. Okay, so we are in a 7th grade science classroom in this article, and what's happening is they're doing some sort of lesson around living and non-living things. I don't know what the broader lesson is, but 7th grade, they're just kind of picking through and talking through and doing some sort of science classification activity. Something that looks like this. Now, this is not the 7th grade work. This is a kindergartner's work, but I use this image off the web to show you that we do this concept from, the beginning of learning on up. We just think about it in different ways. Okay, so as the 7th graders are talking and sorting images, a conversation unfolds around the sun. I'm going to circle the sun here for you in this notebook. So Jonathan speaks up, and Jonathan's identified as an African-American student in this article. And Jonathan, it's been kind of described by the teacher as somebody that the teacher is struggling to engage in the curriculum. Jonathan says, and I quote, "If the sun is non-living, then how does it produce the flowers? Because if you think about it, if something's dead, how does it help another thing out?" Now, think in your head, what would you do as the teacher at this point? What have we done? Well, the teacher in the study basically turned to another student and invited their voice in. And this student happened to be a European white student. And the European white student basically said to Jonathan, it's the same thing as the water. Plants and trees need water, and water is dead. And the teacher kind of affirmed that response and kept it moving. But Dr. Bang and colleagues help us to reframe that a little bit, okay? What they do is they recognize how this is exactly what we're talking about when we need to center different ways of not knowing. Jonathan is actually bringing something really important to the table that's speaking about whose way of knowing and being is often privileged in the science education classroom and also in the curriculum. So I'm actually going to read this from Dr. Bang and colleagues because they say it so beautifully. I don't want to disrupt it. So here we go. In his response, Jonathan resisted being positioned as not understanding or as simply wrong with respect to the student's explanation and the teacher's acceptance of it. He argued that the water-human relationship was not, in fact, an explanation, but the very same question with the very same logic he was exploring. In effect, he was asking about the presumed coherence of the living, non-living binary classification of physical objects like the sun on which earthly life depends, a logic that locates the sun and a toy rocking horse in the same category, which is kind of absurd if you think about it. Okay, continue reading. More than simply questioning, Jonathan was suggesting a different, more dynamic way of seeing the sun and its connection to life on Earth by framing the argument in terms of an essential relationship between the sun and planets. He was moving toward a view of the system as living, working at making ecological that rather than categorical sense. He was thinking from a different, arguably deeper perspective in the curriculum, one closer to contemporary scientific thinking. Further, he was problematizing the settled, implicit epistemological relationship between nature and culture represented in the curriculum. Despite the intellectual force of his argument, he ultimately yielded to the normative authority of the curriculum that the sun belonged in the non-living category. To me, this is a missed opportunity. And I don't blame the teachers because I've done this too, right? Because I'm so focused on getting to an end product, right? Getting to the lesson objective, getting to the content knowledge I need them to master, that I neglect the process. What Jonathan could have been doing there is introducing a dissonance for all of us to wrestle with that would really have given us an entry point into the inquiry process, into the debates that are happening, right? And Dr. Bang references this, right? Into contemporary debates about how we think about relational ontology or not. So that's an example of how we center different ways of knowing. Okay, and students from different cultural backgrounds are going to have different ways in which they construct things from evidence, they think about things, and we have to accept it, and not only accept it, but we have to give it a voice. The last thing that I want to talk about, though, is if we really are going to do our job to move towards more relevant disciplinary literacy, we have to be willing to acknowledge the discrimination that has existed in the disciplines. All disciplines have traces of racism, classism, sexism. And it's because that when research is being cultivated or ideas are being put out there, they're grounded in ideologies and worldviews of the time. I'm going to model this. I need to return back to this idea of a word gap because I can't leave it where I left it. Okay, thanks to the experts, they started to complicate some of the things that were perpetuated by this research. So in one way, I am grateful for this research because this research is cited in a lot of the policies that has expanded early childhood education. I am a former early childhood teacher. I am grateful for the public expansion of early childhood education, but it has come at a significant cost. Because of this research, there has been a lot of deficit perspectives that are grounded in racism and classism that has been perpetuated throughout K through 12 education and on into college. And that is certain groups of people, particularly families from lower socioeconomic statuses, families of color, come without particular rich language experiences. And what has happened is our curriculum then has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to this didactic sort of like, let me feed you vocabulary type of instruction. And it has been harmful. Okay, it doesn't take my sister, who's a scientist, who said like this methodology was terrible, to bring that to light. This conversation has been happening. So this is me saying we need to recognize this in the field, and we need to recognize how this circulates in this building, the damage that has been done because of this research that is discriminatory. Here's an article that Dudley, Marling, and Lucas published around the same idea. If you haven't seen it, read it. If you don't have access to this article, NPR has done a recent segment on this whole idea and how we need to kind of abandon the word gap. And I would encourage you to go listen to that. Okay. So sometimes I get questions at that point, like, well, what does this look like again, right? Like, what if I don't know? Like, again, the beauty of the digital age is it's all up there. I'll plug Shortwave. Shortwave is a great podcast. They're short podcast. They explore a lot of topics of STEM, and they always kind of pull in this idea of like, what is problematic? What do we need to contend with? I just have screenshots here of podcasts or episodes that were released since January 1st that touch upon how this discrimination is happening in their discipline. So I do think it's our job to become aware. You can see the different facets here on the screen. I'm just going to point out this one I just listened to. It was interesting because they talked about like personification of egg and sperm in high school textbooks, and how the sperm is always personified as this like aggressive, assertive, smart, like species, if you will, and the egg is like lazy and docile and resistant, when in fact that is not true. Like it goes through actually what happens, but for some reason we're always personifying them as related to gender normativity. I would love to get into a high school classroom and do a critical reading of that, and how that actually shapes what we come to understand about this process and people. Okay, I don't have time for this, but here's another example of a postdoc at Ohio State University, Rand Anthony, who is doing research where she takes mathematics and she dispels the myth that there's some kind of math genius out there to be good at math. And instead, students go out into the community, they find a hidden figure mathematician, so somebody who's using math in the community all the time, and then they create a STEM project around it that serves the community. At this point, people are like, yeah, if you're listening to me, I've heard about project-based learning, but project-based learning and disciplinary literacy are not exactly the same thing, okay? Because disciplinary literacy is more about the inquiry process, again, knowledge construction and dissemination. And what it does is it says, like, for kids, you should see the disciplines as tools at your disposal to go explore the world in different ways. And sometimes that might mean a product, and other times it's more of a process. Which brings me to the last segment here. Woo, I don't have much time, but I'll get it going faster, which is engaging. So I always say engaging to whom, right? Because a lot of times when my students come in with wonderful plans, by students right now, I'm talking about teacher candidates, they come in with these beautiful plans of like, I'm going to do something where we start a food pantry in the school, or we study cancer and do something with the cancer, the children's hospital, which are great. But I always ask them, like, is that what your students care about right now? So sometimes we think these projects, when we're thinking about inquiry questions, have to be large. And just ignore the stuff on the right. I don't have time right now to talk about it. But basically, one of my mentors, Dr. Ivy, argues that, like, we not only need things that kids can read, but we need experiences that matter to them. And I would argue that this goes across the disciplines. So I'm going to just pull up a bunch of questions that I have done with my kids that have led to disciplinary literacy. One of the ones is, how much candy do I need for Halloween? This is one I do across grade levels, from preschools to college level students, right? I ask that simple question, and then they engage in all types of mathematical thinking using maps. Like in preschool, right, we'll like just kind of count houses, and then I'll ask the questions like, do you think every house has kids in it? So then we'll like cross things out. Maybe in kindergarten, we start skip counting. When I get to college, they are doing this on their own. They're so excited by this question. They're like looking up the weather, and then they're like estimating how the weather is going to predict how many trick-or-treaters. They're looking into neighborhood knowledge, and if we hand out good candy, if that's going to attract people, all these crazy equations that they're coming up with. Okay, but you can see, like, these questions are simple. I do get to some larger issues sometimes. This one here at the end, this one came from a conversation I had with a basketball team once. I think it was basketball. And they were talking about how when they go into different schools, right, like their joke was like, the white neighborhoods have the good schools. And so we actually went ahead and we studied that. A historical lesson. Why could that be? Is that so? And then I asked them, is it true though? Do they have better schools? And the conclusion they walked away with is like, yes, they might have better schools because of funding and de facto segregation, but they don't have better people. That's powerful. All right. I promised I would show you what this looks like. So I have been giving you little snippets, but hopefully this video will kind of make it clear. One of the things that we have to do is not only look at subjects that matter, but we also have to think about how we're engaging students then in talking and thinking about it. Okay, so right now, I was just joking with Molly Davis before this started. It's life cycle time, plant life cycle time. I feel like many grades are doing plant life cycle, particularly in elementary and ECE, but because it's growing season, we might be doing it in other spaces as well. This is a picture of my 2-year-old. He's a scientist with a pacifier, and they're even doing it in his classroom. Okay, now a content literacy lesson plan often looks like this. We define key terminologies, phases, we show a graph, we might read an article or maybe even a picture book if it's young enough, okay? And then we sometimes have them plant a seed and we hang it up in paper towels, right? Plant a seed in a paper towel in a plastic bag, hang it up on the door. I can remember doing this, or on the window, I'm sorry. And we watch it grow and we talk about the parts. When I talk to my son about this, I mean, he's 2, he doesn't want to also talk about it, but as soon as I start asking like comprehension questions, it shuts him down. And I see this with kids of all ages. And Peter Johnson, who's a literacy researcher, has this phrasing that says, if you want to stop engagement, ask comprehension questions. Instead, he argues, focus on engagement. If they are engaged, comprehension will follow. What does he mean by that? Like, rather than set this up and tunnel them into the terms they need to know, how they need to think about it, instead, let them think and then provide the support. So it's kind of like flipping our plans around. I know time is ticking and we need to get to the Q&A, but I'm going to show you real quick in a 2-minute video what this might look like and how it's different than what we traditionally might do through things like a life cycle. I promise this is going to be it, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Okay. All right, this is from Teacher Channel, y'all.
Before we do anything else, I'm going to give you your bean.
Oh, wow.
Even changes from yesterday.
Bathroom beans.
We will be talking about our investigation, talking about our observations, so you're gonna need your bean in front of you. Alrighty, so everyone has their bean, right? Yes. Okay, cool. Today we're gonna focus on our claim, which is our answer to our question. So what is our focus question for today? Emma?
What do kidney beans need to successfully germinate?
What I wanted the students to do was to define the word germinate so that we could build from one small concept up to understanding a full question. Think about our investigations and how that can push you to get a really good definition of the word germinate. Go ahead.
I think germinate is another way to say grow or sprout. I think it means to grow a couple of roots and a stem so that it could at least pop out of the surface it's in a little bit. My bean, I think it germinated and it also changed color.
So do you think that changing color was part of the germinating? So explain how it changed color, though. How did it start out?
It started out as...
It's hard, I think, when you first start to teach this way, to not immediately correct them. Because I think it's important for them to come to it themselves and for students to kind of encourage each other.
Mine has a lot of sunlight because it's in the bookshelf. That's why it's so green. And look at Kenneth's, it's so yellow. And look at me. My leaves are really like look at my roots. Germination means to change the color and grow. Sprout and grow myself. Yes. I think life cycle.
There was some confusion.
No, not the life cycle.
They were just going from germination straight to the whole life cycle of the bean, which for me was frustrating, but to Kimber, it was something great to work from.
What do you think to keep the life cycle going? No.
When you're asking students to actually write out what they've learned and then connect that to evidence, it's a process that I think we haven't always had students go through.
As a teacher, you have a set way that you think it's supposed to be, and then it doesn't turn out that way, but it was for the best.
Okay, I played, and I appreciate the teacher's perspective there because I felt that way as a teacher, right? It's really hard to let kids stay in that unknowing, or what we sometimes refer to as misconceptions, okay? But not thinking them necessarily of misconceptions, but rather as them going through that processes, that trial and error, the observation, making claims, circling back. Like that's the messiness that we want to ultimately invite in classrooms, but that sometimes is not always welcomed. In closing, I'm gonna kind of pull up some screenshots I have here because I want to go back to literacy, of course. If you look at this video and you analyze it, and I do this every semester, and I'm in love with this video because of the subtle ways that these teachers have decided to change this up. I love in the beginning where she said, bathroom beans, come get your bathroom beans, your bookshelves. They are not all putting it on the window. This is not a lab recipe that they're, a laboratory experiment that they're following a recipe for in groups. Okay, they've had some input in the design of this experiment, we'll call it. From there, then they're talking. There is so much buzz in this classroom, and they're all talking about different things. My bathroom bean is yellow and tall. My bookshelf bean is green and leafy, whatever it might be. The vocabulary is there. And then they are using literacy strategically. They're just not reading about life cycles. They're not defining germination, right? They are using charts and graphics. This I love. This is their scientific notebook that they obviously got to personalize. But over here is this beautiful, like, I want to know what this is. I see cutouts there. I see graphs and diagrams. And the reason that this makes me so excited is that this mirrors, and here's one of my sister's papers. I couldn't tell you what it is. I read it. I can't tell you what it is. But by the time you get to the second page, it's full of diagrams and images, right? That's how she's communicating her knowledge. That's how she's helping to say, here are my claims and here are my evidence. The other thing I just want to point out is how social her process is. She works in a lab, right? They do things with mice brains. Look at all the authors, right? Science is a social process of meaning making. So is all the other disciplines, no matter what you're in. We've got to honor that. And then we have to think about the different literacies, make them relevant and engaging. And I think that we might invite more kids into the classroom. 6 minutes left. That's all I have. I welcome your questions. Thanks for joining. I will stop sharing. And Dr. Murphy, I think you were the one that was looking at some of the questions that may be coming in.
Yes, thank you. First of all, so many different things to think about.
There's a lot
and so
there.
Yes, and so many great examples too. We do have a couple of questions. Yeah. We'll start with some logistical questions. Does that video have a title?
Which video?
It was Teacher Channel, the video, the example video.
Yes,
of the
it's
planner.
called, let me scroll down and tell you right now. It is called supporting claims, evidence, and reasoning. There are a couple, there's a series. Some of them I like better than others. So it's not a video that says like, this is disciplinary literacy, but through my analysis, I would argue that they are doing disciplinary literacy.
Wonderful. I was definitely, first of all, can I just say how much I appreciated you starting this webinar with being very clear and explicit about your expertise and the expertise of the audience, right? The audience has expertise in their fields. And while that's not your expertise, I'd just like to say you did a great job on somebody asked, can they see the last slide again?
Which one?
Okay.
The one, not the one with my name, the I have to find it, hold on. The last slide, absolutely. Oh, with my info.
Can you?
I will put my info in the chat. How about that?
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to, there were so many, I have so many questions about the examples, particularly the one from the Dr. Bang study, with this idea of, so you said when you were presenting that there was this missed opportunity. And I'm wondering if you thought that was related to the teacher's response to the student, or maybe to the activity itself with the dichotomy of living and non-living.
Yeah.
How do you think that could look different at, the activity itself might look different to acknowledge the idea that we have living systems, right? It's not just this kind of,
right.
It's either living or dead.
Right. Well, so this epistemology, and again, I'm not the expert here. I know Dr. Jadal is here. She might be able to speak on this, but that way of kind of classifying the scientific world does come up from a particular ideology, right? And so what Dr. Bang is actually saying is she looks at more indigenous perspectives and framings of science, okay? And the way that the student was arguing was actually one that was more in line with that. But we're not going to be the experts of everything. I think we do a disservice in K-12 classrooms, and even in college, when we think like we have full handle on this body of knowledge. We don't. It's always evolving and changing, and so we need to spend our time kind of looking at other ways of thinking about things, right? Being on top of some of the new things. And that's why I give you a podcast. But I mean, you can watch TikTok now sometimes, and they're giving me ideas, right? So some of that is like, yes, how do we enrich the curriculum to whole different perspectives? So in that way, Dr. McPhee, you could structure that a little bit differently. You could put it on a scale. Do we believe in this? However, the curriculum that is our tools frames things a particular way. And I think part of that, and I'm not blaming the teacher because this is what we're often learned. This is how we kind of develop our pedagogy. The teacher, if we get a different set of lenses for what the kid's actually saying, sometimes it's like we have this activity, but let's stop and let's follow that student, particularly the student who you've identified isn't engaging. Can we see the asset that this student is bringing right now that differs from the perspective of the other student in the curriculum? Because there's value in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to get to another question because Caitlin was really active in the chat. And I think an important question that she has is about what are some ways that we can stop disciplinary discrimination in schools?
A good question and a big one. I think the very first step is that we acknowledge.
You have 2 minutes.
Oh my God. And I have 8% left on my computer. This is perfect. So I think the very first thing is we just have to admit that it's there. And once we admit that it's there, we will commit to it and have the conversations with our students. For those who know some of my other lines of research, I look at identity aspects in very young kids. Okay, and so I look at racism and how racism is constructed in early learning environments. Okay, and the truth is that all the isms that we think about, the discrimination is happening on many different playing fields at very young ages, and it's happening in the disciplines. And so we have to just say it's there, and then from there, sorry, Dr. Ward Tyra, who is Dr. Tyra's partner, just hit me up in the chat. So once we acknowledge it's there, I think we have to have open and honest conversations. And that can be a segue into disciplinary literacy. One of the podcasts that I just listened to was talking about how they use kidney disease diagnostic tools and how currently, if you're Black, they double this measure. And it's based on old ways of thinking. I would love to introduce that into a biology class and say, like, should we do this? What do we know about kidneys? Why would we double this for this group of people, right? So to actually introduce these subjects and these conversations into our disciplines, and then we can talk about the historical discrimination and start to work to change.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And we are just about out of time. I'm sorry we didn't get a little more time for Q&A, but that's great. It was very worth hearing everything that Dr. Quast had to share with us. We are getting ready to close now. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Quast, and thank you all for joining us today. We know your time is valuable and we're honored that you chose to spend this hour with us. In just a day or two, you will be able to find a recording of this webinar on the Redbird Educator Series website. Tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to a short survey. If you're interested in receiving a professional development hour for your attendance today, you can find a link to the evidence of completion form at the end of the survey. This is it for our spring webinar series. So have a wonderful summer and be sure to check us out in the fall. Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you all for coming.